Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. Welcome back to those who attended our inaugural colloquium yesterday. As panelists and as attendees, welcome to new attendees and panelists of this second day of our conversation focused on re-envisioning translation studies at this inaugural colloquium. My name is Siri Nergaard, and I am the director of this newfound Center of Advanced Research in Translation at FUSP, located in Rimini, Italy. Yesterday, we had two extremely interesting conversations in which many important themes were discussed. One of the re-envisioning themes was that of questioning and rethinking the history of translation studies. Another was that of considering translation in the first place as semiotic, rather than only linguistic, illustrated through the play Telephone by the artist Nathan Langston. For those who missed these two conversations, they and all the other conversations of this colloquium are being recorded and will be available in streaming on YouTube probably at the end of next week, because there is some editing to be done. And as soon as they are available, you will find the links to the conversations on FUSP's website, which is www.fusp.it, and you will see it probably in the chat if Monica can put up the address, our website address. Thank you. So today we have three more important and three more conversations, equally important and interesting, I'm sure, among other members of the Center's Advisory Board. Before I introduce the first conversation of today, let me thank all again the members of the board for being here as panelists or as attendees, and for having made this colloquium possible. Thank you so much. After these three conversations that we are having, the first one I will be sharing it, the following two will be chaired by Salvatore Mele that you met yesterday. And after the three conversations, we conclude with a plenary discussion at which all panelists are invited to participate. And of course, also the attendees can be involved through the questions. I'm sorry that we cannot invite all people to be present and that we cannot see each other, but there are so many, so that's not possible. So please, if you have questions or comments, please write them and we will use them and read them and answer them as far as possible during the question and answer session. It is both an honor and pleasure to introduce the conversation between Bella Brodzki and Christi Merrill, two colleagues, two friends. Bella Brodzki is professor of comparative literature at Sarah Lawrence College in New York. And for years, she has been interested in translation, working mainly on literary and cultural translation. Among her publications, let me mention her seminal Can These Bones Live? Translation, Survival, and Cultural Memory, which is one of the most important works on the deep connections between translation and memory. Bella has also co-edited, together with Cristina de Maria, the special issue on memory in our journal, Translation, the Transdisciplinary Journal, which shortly will be accessible online in the new open access edition of our journal. Christi Merrill is an associate professor of South Asian literature and post-colonial theory at the University of Michigan in the US, where they have created, mainly thanks to Christi's efforts, I believe, the important interdepartmental program in critical translation studies. Christi is also a translator of oral-based stories of Indian authors, And she's the author of the book Riddles of Belonging, India in Translation and Other Tales of Possession, that she will also talk about today, I think. Her current project is the book of Genres of Real Life, Mediating Stories of Injustice Across Languages, which also includes her translations of Dalit writers. The theme of Bella and Christi's conversation is access, that they discuss focusing on audiobooks, that growing phenomenon of books that you listen to rather than reading them yourselves. Bella and Christi ask what it means to listen to translated work rather than reading it. I think it is worth reminding what Christi told in the video presentation yesterday. The two of them, Bella and Christi, met years ago at one of FUSP's New York symposia, and being together on Research Center's board, they discovered that they are both contending with vision issues. I like that scholars engage in themes and speak about and work on and do research on themes that involve them personally, because it gives their work that commitment and even enthusiasm. And why not also the playfulness that Nathan was so rightly was missing in our translation scholars' approach to our work. Bella and Christi have involved two PhD candidates. One of them is present with us today. And a special welcome to our guest, Julia Iron Martins. And she has collaborated with, she has been involved together with Amanda Kubich, who have assisted, they have both assisted Christi and Bella in the preparation of this colloquium, doing bibliographical research and transcribing. And that was a huge job that you have done, so congratulations. The conversation they already have had, which we today will see the recording of. I understood that you thought it could be a dress rehearsal, but that recording was so good and it was so spontaneous. So you decided that we should use this recording because Amanda couldn't be together with us today. So as a different solution from the other conversations, we will now listen to the recording of the conversation that the four have had. Let me also briefly present our two guests. Julia Iron Martins is a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan Department of Comparative Literature. Her work focuses on the collapse of irony, sincerity, and feminism, post-feminism in digital media, network, subjectivity, and affect theory. In addition to working on the internet, Julia also works on Latin American literature, film, architecture, and translation. I think all these themes are so interesting, so we would like to involve Julia in future sessions too, right? Amanda Kubich, which is not with us, but we will meet her during the recording, is another PhD candidate in the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Amanda's research focuses on the reception of ancient Greco-Roman material by 20th and 21st century American, British, and Greek women poets and performance artists. And she is particularly interested in questions related to translation, gender and sexuality, disability, embodiment, and poetics. Another candidate for future issues and seminars and conferences, etc. Julia and Amanda, yes, you have collaborated, so thank you. And as far as I know, we have another guest, but she's hidden, and that is Katie Kopacz, right, Bella? Welcome to her too, and thank you for her assistance too. You're all very welcome. And now, if you don't have anything explanation to come with before we start, Christi or Bella, we just start the recording.
I might say one thing is, like yesterday, people can put questions in the Q&A box, and we're going to have a few minutes afterwards. We asked Amanda and Julia to ask us questions, which we answer, and then we're going to have some time where Bella, Julia, and I will be talking a little bit more after this. Thank you.
Very good. And as the other sessions, Juliana Schiavi is collecting the questions that you might put on the online, and she will also coordinate those questions and read them. So with Monica Bianchini's incredible capacity and knowledge and technological ability, we can now broadcast the recording of the meeting. Thank you.
All right, this is our dress rehearsal that we might share of a talk that's going to be for next week for the colloquium that the Nida Research Center, Advanced Research Center for Translation is organizing. And Bella Brodzki and I are being helped by Julia Martins and Amanda Kubik. And we're talking today about the sound of translation, access, and audiobooks. And I will say that I'm learning a lot about this I have been learning about this in the last few months based on some conversations that I've been having with Bella Brodzki, who's a fellow member of the advisory board. She's been thinking a lot about translation and audiobooks. And I'd like to start by, Bella, if you could just say why in December you said you thought that this was an important topic to consider in light of some of our conversations about where we want translation to go, or even post-translation. And if you could start by just telling us in a few words what you wrote about and delivered a paper on for the ACLA in 2018.
Well, for a session at the ACLA, which was about translation and temporality, I thought that audiobooks would serve as, a kind of prime example. And that's because about a year and a half before that conference, I had glaucoma surgery, which, not to get too technical, had arrested my spiking and fluctuating ocular pressure, but basically left me unable to read. So I started, scrambling, and there are only two ways, as far as I was concerned, to get books read to me, either other people, friends, assistants, students, relatives, whomever. But the other way, which, sort of helped me maintain my independence, or audiobooks. So audiobooks provided, a very necessary and sort of life-saving, option or opportunity for me. But immediately I realized also posed lots of interesting and I would say critical problems. So as a comparatist, as somebody who is interested in translation studies for its own sake and has done a lot of work in that area, and as I like to say, as both an organic and professional reader, I had, a lot to work with and a lot to consider. So I started thinking about it in a personal way, but of course, what that meant was I had to think about what it meant to be the kind of reader and scholar I had always been in this new context. So that's what the paper is about. What are some of the differences between listening to a book and reading a book? And there are many, but the point of departure was the difference between a physical, printed book, which is in a sense spatially determined, and an audio book, which is, framed temporally.
That's really helpful. Can you say a little bit more then about what you do when you are listening closely, how you're taking your training and applying that in your experiences? We've spoken before about the the ways that you are using an audiobook like Jhumpa Lahiri's and other words in the classroom, where your students have the print book in front of them and you're listening to the audiobook. And if, do I remember correctly that this is a book that you first read before the surgery, and then you're listening to it now after the surgery when it's not comfortable or even really possible for you to read the print book?
Yeah, well, there, you know, as I say, I'm a comparatist, and so I'm constantly thinking about how I used to do something and now I have to do it differently, or how I might have done something, but now I have to do it this way. And I hadn't, yes. So I thought more, initially I was thinking, more about it as a person who wants to hear a book, hear a book read. And in some cases, I suppose, although I hadn't thought about it initially, dramatized, narrated. There are all these different ways to think about how a book gets conveyed to you if you aren't reading it silently to yourself. But immediately I had to think about how it was going to affect my teaching, and did I have any, pedagogical nuggets I could, use. And I would have to say that initially too, I felt it as a lack, since I couldn't turn to any page I wanted or passages that I knew were important. Plumb the depths of a book, using all of my own internal, resources, but suddenly had to rely on either everything I'd already remembered about having read that book, or re-listen to it, but still not have access to, the tools that I, was used to, employing. So I ended up in the end having to rely more on students than I'm used to. That is to say, it's not that I would, I would come into class, I can't read my own notes. I don't have the pages ready, and so it would end up being more of a, I don't know, not a playground, one could argue. It wasn't that playful, but it would require that students be able to work with the text and mediate things that normally I would have already, done in advance. So I was much more reliant on students than I normally would have liked to be, and that left me less in control, from a pedagogical standpoint. I felt that I couldn't direct or guide the discussion as well as I would have otherwise, because I didn't feel I had everything, at my command. Over time, I think I've learned how to, accept that. And I'd have to say that if you're reading something as layered and not only, it's not only that translation is a theme in Jhumpa Lahiri's text, but it's, it's the material itself, and it's a bilingual, two languages facing each other text. So much of that is really visually dependent. It's a very difficult, I think, enterprise to produce that as an audiobook successfully. And if I hadn't had the original experience, I'm not sure I could have handled it that well.
Because what I remember in our discussions, it's not even clear. You don't know when you're listening to the audiobook that there's going to be an Italian version that follows. Yeah, thank you.
No,
so
you don't.
It's published. If let's see, who are we? Julia, if you could, this is the ebook. It's a note on using this ebook, and there's something with Italian and English on facing pages. Is that what I'm? If Julia, if you could read a little bit more about what is on this slide.
Yeah, sure. So on this slide, we have a note that is the first page of text on the ebook. It reads, "This is a dual language edition. Links between the English and Italian have been placed within the text. Tap or click on the little diamond icon to move back and forth between the English and Italian text. Alternatively, tap or click on the chapter titles to move between English and Italian." And then under this, we have a excerpt from the Kirkus review that I have highlighted here, makes note of the Italian and English on facing pages in the print edition. So kind of we can see that even the ebook is unable to do the kind of spatial work of the print book. And then the last image is a user review on another Lahiri book. I think it's an essay, a book of a published essay that is kind of lamenting that there is not a bilingual edition of I think it's the clothing of books. It's saying, oh, I wish there were a bilingual edition of this, like there is of in other words, because even though like the pronunciation is, messy, I still enjoyed hearing it in the Italian. So this is a comment on the ebook of it, or on the audiobook of it, because the Italian audio only comes after she reads the whole thing in English in other words, and then in this other one, there's no Italian.
Can we go, I think the slide before this is the, so this is the Audible version. So it shows us here, you could get it on Kindle, audiobook, hardcover, paperback, audio CD. Oh, that's another medium. It'd be interesting to get out my old CD player, listen to it being read. And so here there's a picture in all of these that I could see of her. I think this is the one that's on the cover of the print book, of her in this really sumptuous library and doing the work of learning Italian ostensibly. And she's already in love with the Italian literary traditions that she's being her early work is already being translated into Italian, and she gets increasingly interested in what she might be if she as a writer. It gives her a new lease on life to be thinking about Italian. But here it does say that the length, am I reading this correctly, 6 hours and 53 minutes, so almost a 7-hour commitment if you want to listen to this being read. And it tells you, but we weren't sure in the sample if that was actually Jhumpa Lahiri reading. But it's really interesting. A few weeks ago, Amanda, Julie, and I, before I had listened to the whole thing, just listened to the sample, and it doesn't really give you a sense. It's very much like how all these tools are set up, where it doesn't give you a sense of the movement between languages that she actually performs in the body of the text itself, where you hear her reading something in Italian and then going into and then kind of reading the English that Anne Goldstein's produced. And she has really nice things to say about her translator, but it's not clear in the packaging or the framing, whichever metaphor you want to use, that's what's happening. So there's all these ways that the setup doesn't allow you to deal with the multilinguality the way that someone such as myself would really like to engage with it. Bella, do you want to listen to that that sample together and discuss it a little bit, or do you want me to say more about framing, or what would you like?
Yeah. No, I think we should listen to the sample.
Okay, so Amanda, or
yes, I think I can. I have it pulled up here, and I think if I change the way that my speakers are working, we should be able to listen.
Great. And while you're getting that set up, if I could ask Bella to say a few more words about how this audio edition is another way of thinking about translation and helps us reorient ourselves in terms of what we like to think of as translation, or how this constitutes a new vista in post-translation studies, as you're quoting some of our fellow board members as asking us to think about.
Wow. Well, if we, think about translation as not only interlingual, obviously, or intertextual for that matter, but also, I think it was Roman Jakobson who said that intersemiotic, right, and is another form of translation. That's what I would call what we're doing here is. So technology is what enables it and possibly disables translation in many regards, I think, in this case in particular, because there's so many elements at stake that can't be rendered. I wouldn't go so far as to say they're untranslatable, but to some extent they definitely get lost. So if you didn't know what you know, you would be you'd lack a crucial dimension of this particular text. But so I think that how books cross all kinds of boundaries and barriers and forms and modes of, inscription, transcription, and delivery. That's the business of translation studies, and now more than ever, I don't think these things happen seamlessly, but they happen rather marvelously, but they deserve to be attended to because there's a lot of fudging around the edges. And the more that people listen to audiobooks without being aware of what they're not getting or what the processes are that are at stake and the decisions that have had to be made in the preparation, of that book, the more that people are aware, I think, the better off the products will be. And having said that, I would say that we're perfectly poised to do that because we do really know what a book involves. And a book is not just, the story being, read to you. So I think that's simply put what my initial concerns are and why I think that translation could really be at the center of very important, work, cultural work that is yet to be done.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to, I'm going to change things up just a tiny bit. If it's possible to just show the slide, if Amanda, you can go back and forth like that, of the cover of Riddles of Belonging. Because so this is, we were just talking about this, but I think it's really relevant here. So this is a storyteller from India who's also a political activist, and I heard him tell a story in Ann Arbor, and I talk about this. I'm going to have you toggle back and forth between two different slides. I talk about this in the introduction to Choboli and Other Stories, which is a collection that I have. Let's see. Yes, that. So this is a translation that I worked on of the work of Vijayan Deta. And one of the stories that's in this collection ends up being called Weigh Your Options. So if you go back, thank you, to this, I had been translating it and it wasn't funny, and I decided I wasn't going to include it in the collection. And then I went to a talk that this Hindi storyteller gave when he was on tour in America. And he told the story that I'd been trying to translate, and everyone in the audience laughed. And then when his English interpreter, Aruna Roy, translated for him, said it was that he had read Vijayan Beta's version of this oral story in Hindi translation, and then he told it in his own oral version. And I make an argument in this book, Riddles of Belonging, that this is also a translation. And I go back to the Hindi word for translation, which, using some of Bella's formulations, is a temporal understanding of translation that you tell in turn. Anuwad is you tell after you've heard someone's version. And I argue in both of them, both Riddles of Belonging as well as the introduction to the translations, that this way of approaching stories is very different and disrupts some of the chronologies that for example, Derrida talks about, and of grammatology that, Bella, you cite in the paper, the ACLA paper that you shared with us. And in this context, I think is really important, because one of the things that I discovered in Indian tradition, you can have a text that is fixed and oral, and these texts, I argue, are fluid and written and go back and forth between oral and written, so that the orality, I think, that we're talking about here in the audiobooks is fixed, and there's a whole new way of that we have to understand translation in order to really get at what's going on in these fixed audio texts that's different than the movements back and forth between oral and written that requires more inventiveness and creative extemporaneous moving things around, like people talk about in The Singer of Tales. Albert Lord talks about Homer as being an oral-based writer. It's controversial, but I think it's a really interesting point. So if we could use that to think about the temporal versus spatial understanding of translation that frames the way that we think about what we're hearing when we hear Jhumpa Lahiri read. If you can help us, Amanda, go back to that. And then we'll listen to it a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit more to finish off this part. And then hopefully Amanda and Julie, you can ask us a little bit more for our remaining few minutes. I'm not sure, did I see that's 3 minutes and 22 seconds? So maybe just a little bit of it, and then we can have.
She sees pretty well.
Yeah. I don't hear her.
Oh, you can't hear anything? Okay.
There should be a check box that says, if you, maybe you need to stop sharing your screen and try it again.
Maybe I need to unplug my headphones. 1 second.
Okay.
Let me do, is it internal microphone that should work with this?
I think so.
Okay. Let me.
But I just know for me, when it was sharing the screen, there's a box that I have to check to make sure that the sound can be heard.
Right. Okay, if I play it now, let me know if you can hear anything.
No. And even though I know how to swim, I'm afraid of being alone in the water without any support. The lake I'm talking about is in a secluded, isolated place. To get there, you have to walk a short distance through a silent wood. On the other side, you can see a cottage, the only house on the shore. The lake was formed just after the last ice age, millennia ago. The water is clear but dark, heavier than salt water, with no current. Once you're in, a few yards from the shore, you can no longer see the bottom. In the morning, I observe people coming to the lake, as I do. I watch them cross it in a confident, relaxed manner, stop for some minutes in front of the cottage, then return. I count their arm strokes. I envy them. For a month, I swim around the lake, never going too far out. This is a more significant distance, the circumference compared to the diameter. It takes me more than half an hour to make this circle. Yet I'm always close to the shore. I can stop. I can stand up if I'm tired. It's good exercise, but not very exciting.
Let's stop there. Thank you very much. Bella, you want to say something about this?
Yeah, it's about translation.
Yeah, she uses this throughout She keeps coming back to this trope and chats about it as ocean, and yeah, but how does that help us in think about audiobooks as translation?
Well, I think if you were just listening to it, you know, as a naive audio reader / listener, it would sound as if it were a book written in English, recounting a very fascinating, I think, and moving experience, but it would be decontextualized completely. Yeah, I'm trying to imagine myself, not me, listening to this.
Well, what's something that you hear that is very you, and maybe wish that would be part of the framing or the packaging of this audiobook?
Well, you know, it sounds as if she's, learning, she's encountering a foreign language, right? So she stays near the borders where it's safe. She doesn't tread too deeply in it. She's envious of people who can speak the language. There's something both, you know, intuitive and physical involved. You know, what it reminds me of too, in terms of audiobooks, is, you know, they require a technological intervention, but then at some point, you know, you're sort of, you're just thrown in, you know, nothing's going to help you, right? Except something you can't know in advance or you know, or count on, except for maybe the experience you come to it with. So that's that. I think, you know, I'm trying to think about without over interpreting the passage. Maybe I'll just stop here.
If I may, let's have, I think it'd be helpful to have Amanda or Julia, you two decided, like each of you, to tell us a little bit, if it would help to contextualize some of the things you've discovered this summer as we've been meeting, and you've been reading, if you'd like. Not necessary, but tell us more about this example, or go broader if you'd like. You've got the catbird seat, so each of you, if you could ask us a question, and please direct which of us you would like to start, and then the other one can add if they want.
I'm happy to ask sort of a broader question that I think is related to this example, but I know, Christi, it's something that we've talked about, so maybe you could answer first, and then Bella, if you would like to add. I'm thinking about, excuse me, the process of composing a book, and the way that, you know, it seems like when we're thinking about composition, it's always the kind of written text that then gets composed into an audiobook. And I'm wondering if, thinking in the future, what it would be like to sort of compose an audiobook first that then sort of gets translated into text, and how that might make us think about writing differently, or about, you know, bookmaking differently. And if something like Jhumpa Lahiri's text, you know, if we're thinking about it, if it had been sort of an oral story first, right, or an oral story, how that might change the way that it's read.
Great question. And it actually makes me think. I'm going to say three things quickly, and then maybe I'll say a little bit more. But one is that actually Bella and I have been thinking about what happens if it's audio first. And one of the things I've been noticing as I listen more to the distinction between the radio shows that I'm used to listening to, and then how they're creating podcasts, is that their need for the podcast, you can hear an informality, like hopefully we have here, that takes advantage of that kind of spontaneity, and that's part of what's being marketed, that I think of more as that fluidity that I was just talking about, when you recreate something in the moment with a story. So, and this also reminds me of a talk I went to. This is going to be surprising as an analogy. Art Spiegelman came to MOCAD, I think, the think that's what it's called, the Contemporary Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit. And this is years ago, 2009, I believe. And he asked us, how many people in this room have published a book? And then of you, how many people know what font it was in, what kind of paper, how many words per page? And almost all the hands went down, and the only hands that were still raised were the people who had produced comic books.
Mhm.
And his contention was that he, as a comic book artist, has to know his medium really well, because he's trying to use it really carefully. And I feel like that is true, that the experiences that we have as we get more and more savvy about how to use this medium is going to really help the ways that we produce this. And another thing I'm very interested in is finding out what has happened behind the scenes, that Jhumpa Lahiri was interested in reading this bilingual book bilingually. And if she also read the Italian, I believe she does, but I want to find out about that, because I know I've heard Toni Morrison talk about why it was important for her to record herself reading her stories. Bella, I heard that as one of the examples in your ACLA paper. So I think that it's a really interesting medium that is changing quickly, not just the technologies, but our ways of thinking about it. And that bringing translation and an awareness of multilinguality in translation into our understanding of this as a temporal performance, I think is going to really change some of the conventions and the protocols. And I was kind of mentioning that one storyteller, but I interviewed all these storytellers about the conventions that they use to think about their work and what makes a successful oral performance. I think that work is more akin to what we're thinking about now than a lot of the things that I've been working on with translation and orality. Bella, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm very interested in what you just said. So my initial response was going to be to another analogy, which is I teach, as you do, world literature, right? Or what I like to call, global writing. And one of the translation related issues that have to do with the globalization of English is that lots of writers who don't originally write in English, for example, Murakami, but who anticipate being translated into English and having that marketability be the most, in a sense, the most critical thing about their writing careers at this point, write in Japanese with an ear to having it be translated. And so there's something that they're already doing that facilitates that on the level of I'll just say the sentence, And so people call that translationese, right? Or globalish, or there's something that's interior or hidden, it's behind the scenes, so to speak. But it's already built into, incorporated into the first act of writing. And, it's seen as somehow weirdly corrupting, you could also say it's very freeing. I mean, it's probably both on some level, but I think that's an interesting analogy. And I think it's relevant here. The other thing I wanted to say about Spiegelman is, and what he was obviously calling attention to, the materiality, the real materiality of the text, and the fact that a comic is, visual and textual. One of the things I remember him talking about in terms of what needed to be, in a sense, perfect, if not, just accurate, was that when he was drawing scenes of the crematoria, he studied the exact dimensions of the crematoria at Auschwitz, so that when he produced the drawings, they were appropriate to the frame. And, most readers don't know that. But all of that work makes possible this product, and I think in terms of audiobooks already being what they're going to be, even though what we're privileging is spontaneity, fluidity, the imprévu and all that. I think it's very interesting because it is going to create its own, in a sense, dictates, but we probably don't know exactly what they are yet.
Great. Julia, can you bring this home?
Okay, so I have a couple, some I can ask on the 29th, I guess. But one question is kind of there's kind of research about how when audiobooks first started being introduced, like in the 1930s, when they were called talking books, there was an emphasis on not having a performative reader because this was understood as like an adaptation rather than a preservation of what was on the page. And there's, I think there was a line I read that was specifically about how like the talking book should not improve the print book. So I'm curious about what we make of the audio being understood as improvement, but also when we're talking about translation versus adaptation versus media, how does the difference between, how do we kind of define adaptation versus translation, especially when we're talking about the audio adaptation of a translated work?
Let's have Bella, if you don't mind.
Well, I think all I can say right away is that I think some books are better suited initially. And I can't remember if it was the talking book where I read this, but someone argued early on that 19th century novels were the ideal kinds of books for audiobooks. And, the reasons were, there are all these dramatis personae, all these, different voices and roles and characters that could be, performed, and they're plot driven and, they're just more dramatic and more lively than lots of other kinds, perhaps other kinds of narratives. And so I think, this question about what's the original and what's the translation and how critical certain kinds of adapting techniques will be, again, over time, I think is really interesting. And I guess, we're now in a very compressed moment in this regard. It's evolved slowly, but now it's very accelerated. I have to think more carefully about this.
I'll say one thing to add to that. When I heard just this clip, I was really confused about whether this was computer generated. And as I listened to the whole book, Jhumpa Lahiri read the whole book, I realized that she's worked really hard. She has a very studied way of reading both the Italian and the English. And it reminded me of my French teacher from college. I was told she has such perfect French that you don't think that she's actually a native French speaker because native French speakers will make a mistake, whereas she never makes a mistake. And that's the goal. It's more the goal that I hear my family members who are trained musicians are after, to have a flawless performance. And I when I heard her more, I heard the vulnerability in that perfection when I could hear her read. And it's very different than some of the actors, I think your question is also really wonderful in bringing this out. The trained actors, like Ryan Cantor's article shows that they study, prepare for their roles the way you do like method actors, and you really try to inhabit that role. And I know the storytellers that I recorded in Rajasthan would switch voices, including to convey that they were repeating something, like the quotation on the slide, the narrator is repeating the husband's justification for abusing his wife that the narrator doesn't agree with. And you can, a very talented storyteller can perform that irony, and writers can convey that in the way they write, but I don't hear that every reader is able to convey that. And I'm not sure if that goes with what you were saying about affect, Bella, but I do think it's something to add to the arsenal of being able to be multilingual and move back and forth between languages, but also in a way that gets at these really complicated relationships to the languages and the conventions that we hear. Bella, I can.
Yeah. So, so I think the irony is something that really needs to be pursued. That's really interesting how irony gets inflected, that way in a reading. But I would say that very often, not if it's the author reading, but if it's an actor or, a trained reader reading, that they change voices when a character change, when a character changes gender, when there's a change in gender. And so to denote gender differences and also age. I've noted, many times that if it's supposedly a child speaking, they try to make their voice sound younger, more childlike. And if it's person much older, they try to make it sound like an elderly person. And, sometimes it seems fine, but sometimes it's thoroughly annoying, and it calls attention to something that shouldn't be called attention to. So when a male voice is trying to sound like a woman, quote unquote, or vice versa, it just makes you more conscious of how false it all is and how artificial it is. Because in fact, I'm thinking it's not to be, a novel is not to be dramatized, it's to be read. But we could argue about this, maybe that's not true in all cases, and maybe it's not the most desirable way to use the medium. I'm not sure.
It sounds to me like we could talk for hours and hours, but we're already over the time we had allotted. I agree. And I just have to say, Julie and I have spent a lot of time talking about ironic distance, which is another spatial metaphor. So yes. I feel like there could be a whole podcast on audiobooks, translation, and irony. But
absolutely,
tune in next week.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Bella, Christi, Julia, and Amanda. This was really, really interesting. And not only I was following with big interest, also so many others. And so maybe Juliana can take over and read a few of the questions that we have received. Do you have comments that you want to say something, Bella or Christi, before? Mm-hmm. So then you can take over, Juliana, and thank you. Thank you again.
Okay, good. Hi, Bella, Christi. Hi, everybody. I'm here to take care of the question and answer session. And there are a few very, very interesting questions, and I'll try to put them in a sort of order because, of course, they are quite different among them. The first one comes from Beverly Curran, and it says, the sonic translation draws attention to how the performance of the text and speakability changes the choices of the translator. So what can audiobook translation learn from work on song translation and theater, in your opinion?
Bella, I guess, would you like me to say?
Why don't you start? Yeah.
Okay. Oh, and I realized Siri had invited me to note a thanks to the University of Michigan LSNA Spring Summer Research Fund that allowed me to hire Julia and Amanda, who have been so great to talk with and think around these issues. We're only just starting to dip our toes in, and thanks again to the foundation too for giving us this opportunity. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the Rita Copeland distinction between the interpretation and the performance. And I think, to me, this way of thinking about our work as translators, when we read something and then we interpret and then we perform it, there's a whole different rhetoric when we're thinking about the audiobook rhetoric and the performance. And I agree, Beverly, and hello, Beverly. I think we were in Delhi together at a conference more than 2 decades ago, that we that I agree it's really interesting to think about performance in these multiple ways, and I think it reinvigorates it. And another thing I noticed when we were kind of looking at the screen, I can see more than Bella can, and I could see that it says it's narrated by Jhumpa Lahiri, but you can, it's a visual framing that's, and I was calling it packaging in our discussion last Friday. I don't know how we can think about the audio performance that makes that transition so that it orients the listener to know some of that crucial information, but it's you don't hear it, I know, when you listen to the audiobook. So it's really interesting not only to think about some of the stagecraft involved in these different kinds of performances, but also how we signal temporally to the listeners that we can we need to be in our seats and we need to all be listening together. And I know there are different conventions in different kinds of performances, and I think it would be a really useful comparison to make. Bella, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, you know, I think the difference between a performance and a production is actually important here. So at the end of an audiobook, most often it will say this audiobook was produced for you by, and then we'll tell you who the person was who read it. I think a production has different implications than a performance. And in relation to what we discussed before about the fixed aspects of certain kinds of oral performances, this is fixed in the sense that there's only one version of it. And sometimes there are mistakes and flaws on the level of pronunciation. And if it's either a translated text or a text that has to use foreign words, sometimes terrible things happen and very cringeworthy things happen. And if one is familiar with the way a particular language is supposed to sound by, we'll, you know, say a quote unquote native speaker, it's very troubling. So it adds to the human element, which maybe is important. But the irony is it's not produced in the way that I would have liked, you know, and as the listener, I'm captive. So there's so many things, again, I don't know when I'm listening to a book, and there are signs I can't take advantage of, detect, but then there are things that I do know, and the expectations that one has as a spectator, an observer, as well, and as a listener, all come to the fore, you know, in those instances.
Thank you. And there is a question by Caroline Shred, and she asked, did you have any students in the class who habitually use audiobooks? And if so, I wonder if they have thoughts on how audiobooks might be developed to better communicate translation, as well as what the oral medium adds to the understanding of a translation that might be missed on the page?
What I would say is that no, I'm pretty strict, and we're pretty strict about students reading the actual physical material printed book. I have performed experiments with students where I've asked them to listen to parts of a book to get the audio version and then compare it to what they read. But for the most part, they are not keyed into audiobooks. So I think that there are kinds of books that are truly enhanced because they have poetic aspects to them that merit being highlighted. And very often when it is indeed the author who's reading, those translational elements do get privileged. But I'm not so sure that students are otherwise very aware of audiobooks as a real instrument to be engaged with in the way that one engages with a literary text that's being read on the page, at least in my experience.
It seems to me it's much more the way that I've only recently started delving into this, so I haven't really gotten to ask the students very much. But the little bit that I'm aware of is there's another version of just trying to find translated material in book form to teach in courses. And oftentimes I have to spend a lot of time disabusing students of this feeling that if they're reading a translation, then they are kind of slumming it somehow. And I feel like audiobooks is similar, with the added problem that there's not much that I would assign in my South Asian literature courses that is available in audiobooks. And it's a funny irony that Jhumpa Lahiri in this book talks about always being slotted in as a South Asian writer, even though she's an American writer writing first in English and then in Italian. It's her mother who wrote poetry in Bengali, but she's been an American English language writer, and I have not taught her work before this. So Julia, you were nodding. I wondered if you had something you wanted to add to this.
Oh, not really. I mean, I've taught podcasts before, but I haven't had a student write on a podcast. But I think that like maybe one thing to think about in terms of teaching audiobook is similar to teaching film, how there are screening times, because I think my sense is that students would probably like listen to the audiobook while doing something else, which would kind of maybe prevent them from what Bella calls close listening in her ACLA paper. But that may be kind of a move to think about teaching like audio material generally, is to actually have like a designated like class listening time where you do kind of engage in sitting and just listening to something together.
I mean, one other thing I would say is that there are people who think that audiobooks, are intellectually lazy ways to get, access a novel, for example. And I know that in book groups, people apologize. They're very anxious, about the fact that they didn't quote unquote read the book. They listened to it on Audible. And so, and also they think that it's an inferior derivative version, just as some people think translations are inferior derivative versions of an original work. So I think there's a lot of things one can do, first of all, to improve the production, the performance in any case, but also to make people aware that it's not the lazy way to hear a book or to read a book. It's just a different way, but that the version has to be improved. The package, as as Christi said, has to be improved. And that has to do with, I think, providing more paratextual information and not just having the listener be dropped into something with, no really helpful points of reference.
May I ask a question? I know that is not, it's one of the many questions, but going back to an audiobook, a translated audiobook, can we say that apart from the translator's one, there is an extra interpretation, which is that of the person who reads it, intonation, stresses, etc., and so giving an extra voice to the authors and translators one, or a sort of directing the perception of the text in a more fixed way? You see what I mean?
I do. I think we mentioned briefly a really wonderful article by Roanne Cantor where she interviews some of the readers, narrators, I'm not sure, the performers of the books that are in some of the audiobooks that she studied. And I don't think this was in the recording, but I discovered that one of the examples that she refers to is someone she interviews is the same performer who read one of Jhumpa Lahiri's works. And I was thinking about the difference between the radio broadcast of, I'm now forgetting, Selected Shorts. And I was thinking it'd be a very interesting comparison to hear one of the actors on a, produced for video, for radio, how they're reading one of Jhumpa Lahiri's stories versus the production values and audiobooks. And here I do think that distinction between production and performance is really interesting, and thinking about production values in a different way. I just want to make a little plug that when I started leading development teams to design websites, I believed then, before I knew I had vision issues, that designing for people with different abilities produces better design. And I think that's especially true now that I'm one of the people that benefits from all the work that goes into producing an audiobook that can be used in for scholarly translation needs. And I think one of the things that we've been talking about informally is how often the person who has vision issues is pitied and then ignored. And I think that both Bella and I have some insights to contribute, and I just don't want to be pitied for having vision issues, but actually saying, I need to hear a cue that tells me who's reading this, the fact that it's translated, to hear when the audio of the Italian is going to come, and to have to be thinking more about our protocols, so that I love this idea of a whole class sitting together to have a screening and listen together, and what that means to listen together to an audiobook being broadcast, because we have protocols for different protocols for watching a movie together, that lovely theorists like Roland Barthes have written about really in beautiful ways. I think that could also happen with the audiobooks, and it could be a shared experience synchronously as well as asynchronously.
Thank you. Thank you. May I ask Monica if we can grab a few minutes from the break time in order to give voice to a couple of more questions? I think we can. So I decided that we can. There's a comment by Brian Baer. He says that it's interesting that on the website it says narrated by Jhumpa Lahiri, not read by. This suggests greater agency for the reader than we often give the translator. I wonder if this is the typical wording or whether narrated by is used because it is the author reading it.
Well, I go back and forth between narrated by and read by. And I think that read by, makes it sound more personal and adds an affective element to it, because there is something very warm and heartening about having someone read to you. I mean, I think there's a deep psychoanalytic component to this. And so if the conditions are right, having someone read to you is one of the best things, you know, in the world. Having something narrated, you know, obviously sounds much more formal and formalist, and then suggests all sorts of other interventions. And so they're both correct, I think. And maybe, you know, depending on the context, one should use one word rather than another. But when something is read to you, I hate to keep harping on the idea of mispronunciation, intonation, inflection, but of course that's the way the language is delivered. And it's only exquisitely painful and enraging when you know the language. But when you don't know the language, you don't know how many times the original, the source text is being mutilated or distorted in the process. It's only when you can anticipate and even, already have an anterior relationship to what's being read or narrated to you that relationship is really on the line. And the notion of voice, which we haven't talked about at all, but is obviously for literary people very important, really comes into play here on a number of levels. You know, what is primary, you know, the voice or writing? There are all sorts of questions, I think, that can be engaged in this regard.
I also think it's related to what we were talking about before with irony. One of the things that's really hard with students, especially, is when I'm hearing something as ironic and they're not. And sorry, I'm going to get nerdy again today. I was going to try not to, but Wayne Booth talks about this distinction where you get a sense that the author's getting you to call into question the narrator's perspective. So you have a distinction between what some of the cues that the text is giving you about how to read something, and then what you're hearing the narrator say, and you start to call that into question. That's what opens up that ironic distance. Mm-hmm. So if you're picturing the narrator is the voice, then I'm not sure how you can hear that ironic distance, but I think that I remember years ago kind of arguing if all translation is ironic, is all nonfiction ironic, because you're already having that gap that's developing between that sort of what you imagine the voice to be saying, and then what you think of as the other ways that you're being signaled to call that voice that you're trying to rely on, call that into question. So that the question of the reliability of the narrator assumes a really different form when you're translated in on audiobook.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have another, unfortunately, I cannot read all the questions, but I have another one, which is by Babli Moitra Saraf. And she says, have you studied children's response to texts that they cannot read yet? Their response to orality recitation is another point of entry into this discussion. In my experience of working on popular nursery rhymes adapted into Hindi, framed with parallel texts and semiotic translation in figures and landscapes, worked very well if the move into Hindi kept the beat. Any comments, please?
Yeah, the writer that I was showing the screen of, Vijayan Deta, he uses a Rajasthani opening convention called a chogo that is rhyming. And when I first was trying to translate this in the translation workshop at Iowa, they said it sounded like Dr. Seuss, and it was getting everyone in the mood for, not in the mood for ethnic violence and domestic abuse and things like that. So I was trying to figure out how to kind of use those oral conventions the ways that he does. I think Katha did a really good job. They've used a lot of those stories in English and Hindi in their, the press that published them originally in Delhi moved to using them a lot in the classrooms, and they've been doing a lot of work, but that's not how the direction my research has taken. I think it is really interesting. Bella, you were about to say something too.
No, I hadn't thought about this at all, really. I think it's really rich. I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done in this area, in fact.
Okay, thank you. I think that we finished our question and answer session because I think it's time for a break. Am I correct, Siri?
It's time for a break, even if we would have loved to continue the conversation, because here I am. Hello, because it's so interesting. So, but I think we all need a break before the next session. So let me also thank you again for a very, very interesting conversation. And the recording was perfect, and interesting discussion afterwards. So thank you again. And maybe things can be taken up in the plenary discussion later. Thank you. And we meet again in a little less than a quarter of an hour, which means that we meet at local time 4:30. And you should find out what it means in your time zone. Here in Italy and in Norway too, it's 4:30. See you later, and thank you again.